And we are going live. Okay, Melissa, I'm going to make you the host, and you can make me the co-host, please.
All right, sounds
there
good.
You go.
Looks like that worked. Okay, very good. It looks like we have a few people joining us already, but we had a bit more on our
You're
list.
all ready. I'm sorry, you're all ready to go.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Okay, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so we had a few more people on the list of registered participants. So we'll wait just a few more minutes, see if they'll be joining us, and we'll get started in just a few. All right, looks like we have a few more now, so I'll go ahead and get started. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. My name is Melissa Corona, and I'll be giving you a presentation tonight on the Water Quality Restoration Plan for the Tijuana River. As you can see, we also have some other people in attendance from the San Diego Water Board, including Cynthia Gorham, who leads our Restoration and Protection Planning Unit, and Dave Gibson, our Executive Officer. All right, so just give me one moment to pull my slides up. Okay. So let me put it in presentation mode. So today's workshop, in today's workshop, we're going to provide an overview of a draft water quality restoration plan that we have prepared to address bacteria and trash pollution in the lower Tijuana River. We also want to receive verbal comments from any interested parties on the draft restoration plan, and also receive any verbal comments related to any kinds of concerns of environmental justice or potential impacts on water quality for disadvantaged communities and our Native American tribes. And this would be impacts due to future implementation of the restoration plan. And this last component relates to Assembly Bill 2108, which includes requirements for outreach to disadvantaged communities and tribal communities. We're here because it's important that those affected by border pollution in this region are aware of the work that we're doing and have a chance to ask questions and provide input. As we expressed in our practical vision document, which guides the San Diego Water Board's work, communication and transparency are two of our core values, and community engagement is a high priority for us. This restoration plan has its roots in those principles. More specifically, in a 2017 symposium the San Diego Water Board hosted to hear the public's environmental justice concerns. Border water quality was expressed as a top concern and priority. We have been involved in many collaborative efforts over the years, but members of the public made it clear that they wanted us to use more of our traditional regulatory tools to address the concern. We have continued the collaborative work through the Tijuana River Valley Recovery Team, Minute 320, and input on the development of projects through the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. I'll be referring to the USMCA a bit in this presentation. But we also developed this restoration plan, which includes implementation actions to reduce sources of pollution. We hosted a CEQA scoping meeting in 2019 when we initiated the project and have been providing updates to the public through our website and executive officer reports. At this stage in the process, we want to give you an overview of the restoration plan while it's still in draft format. So that way you can provide input on it before we finalize it and present it to our board members. We don't have a date scheduled for that yet, but it'll be sometime this year. Our board meetings are open to the public and always allow for public comment. So there will also be an opportunity for you to share comments with our board on the restoration plan when they are considering it for adoption. For today, because we want everyone that wants to provide comments on the restoration plan to have an opportunity, we're asking that comments be limited to 3 minutes, and we're asking that questions and comments be related to the workshop theme, the restoration plan specifically. The chat isn't turned on, but in case you prefer to provide comments in writing rather than verbally, I will share a mailing address and an email address with you at the end of the presentation. Before I provide an overview of the draft restoration plan, I would like to give you some background information for context. In the restoration plan, we focus on a very small portion of the river, and that's the lower portion that crosses from Mexico into the U.S. So it's just this tiny little portion here, right, at the most downstream portion of the Tijuana River watershed. But that's not how rivers actually work. They're not disjointed like that from their watershed. And this watershed is a very large watershed. Its area is about 1,750 square miles, and about 2/3 of that area is in Mexico. You may already know that the watershed supports a diverse array of wildlife, and for those who have safe access, it provides excellent recreation with all the physical and mental health benefits that come with it. The watershed has a profound story that began long before jurisdictional limitations and concrete channelization dominated the story. The diverse landscapes across the watershed have supported a wide variety of rich habitats over many, many years. Tribes have been connected with the watershed and the coastal areas that it meets since time immemorial. As poet Joy Harjo expresses, what especially makes indigenous cultures unique is the relationship to the land. Land is a being, an entity, a repository of meaning. There is an ongoing relationship with the land. It is the keeper of our bones, stories, and songs. In this manner of thinking and being, there is no hierarchy to differentiate value between all living things. We won't be delving into that deeper story of the watershed today, but it's important to acknowledge it exists and how it is reflected in the holistic value of the river, the watershed, the ocean, and everything they are connected to and part of, physically and otherwise. But for the sake of today's theme, let's zoom back into the lower Tijuana River specifically. The lower Tijuana River refers to that stretch that crosses the border from Mexico into the U.S., where we see the red arrow, traverses the Tijuana River Valley and Tijuana River Estuary, and ultimately reaches the Pacific Ocean, where we see the red dot at the river's mouth. The Tijuana River Valley is less than 1% of the watershed area, and this stretch of the lower river is only about 6 miles in length. We all know that the river is plagued with pollution. And today we want to talk to you about what we think it will take to restore water quality in the river. We know that there are different sources of pollution that come from the U.S. and Mexico. The sources in the U.S. are well controlled by regulations. There's no question that the vast majority of the pollution comes from Mexico. Proposed USMCA projects that have been studied by federal agencies offer a lot of promise, but we need agreements and funding in place to advance these projects. To implement the Tijuana River Restoration Plan, the San Diego Water Board will rely on a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, with federal agencies and funding to make these projects a reality, to make the restoration a reality. I will get into the implementation and the MOU specifically a little later in the presentation. The Tijuana River watershed and the river itself straddle the U.S.-Mexico border, of course. In the U.S., we have federal and state clean water regulations, and at the federal level, those come from the Clean Water Act. We can only apply those regulations north of the border, which of course complicates our efforts to control sources of pollution. The Clean Water Act directs us to restore and protect waters that don't meet water quality standards. States are required to identify these waters and categorize them as impaired, and then add them to what's called the 303D list. This refers to Section 303D of the Clean Water Act, where the listing requirement comes from. The lower Tijuana River is listed as impaired on the 303D list. Although there are other impaired water bodies in our region on the 303D list that must be addressed, the San Diego Water Board has chosen the Tijuana River as one of the high priority impaired water bodies to focus on. It is a high priority to our board and to the public due to the severe magnitude and duration of the pollution that have created a public health crisis. The state has several options for strategies on restoring polluted waters. These are outlined in the state's impaired waters policy. There's no one-size-fits-all strategy because circumstances for each case can vary so much. There can be many factors, like the type of pollutant and its sources, the types of beneficial uses the water support, efforts that are already underway to restore water quality, resources that are available, willingness of responsible parties. Factors like these can influence which path forward will be most impactful. So the role of the impaired waters policy is to guide the water boards in selecting the most appropriate path forward given all the conditions. Fortunately, there is already momentum in the Tijuana River, and in cases where immediate restoration activities are available, the policy encourages those actions to take place as soon as possible. For that reason, the San Diego Water Board opted to develop a water quality restoration plan to meet the goals of the impaired waters policy. It's technically referred to as an Advanced Restoration Plan, or ARP, in regulatory guidance. And we chose this option because compared to other options in the impaired waters policy, the restoration plan is more practical due to these factors listed here: the unique binational circumstances, an obvious significant source of pollution, collaborative willingness of the primary responsible party, well-developed project proposals to address the pollution, time sensitivity of securing federal project funding, and the flexibility for adaptive implementation compared to other strategies in the impaired waters policy. The draft ARP for the lower Tijuana River includes the pollutants of concern, pollutant sources, total maximum daily loads, load and waste load allocations, an implementation plan that includes the MOU I referred to earlier, and monitoring and assessment needed to track progress. I will go over these briefly, but spend a little more time on the implementation plan. After that, I will open it up to questions and comments on the ARP. The lower Tijuana River is on the 303D list for 20 pollutants. If you count the river, estuary, and adjacent stretches of coastline, there are over 50 303D listings. Much of that is for indicator bacteria. For this ARP, indicator bacteria refers to two types: E. coli and Enterococci. These types of bacteria are called indicators because they indicate the potential presence of pathogenic bacteria and viruses in fecal contaminated water. As we know, fecal contamination from sewage in the Tijuana River contributes to high bacteria levels, resulting in frequent beach closures and creates health risks for recreational users. For years, the beaches from Borderfield State Park to Imperial Beach have been closed regularly, and since December 2021 have been continuously closed. The other pollutant of concern we addressed in the ARP is trash. This refers to all solid wastes, things like plastics, glass, metals, and waste tires. Although there are other pollutants in the river, controlling the sources of indicator bacteria and trash will help control other pollutants since they are commingled in discharges to the lower river. This will also benefit the estuary and adjacent coastlines. There are two categories of sources when it comes to indicator bacteria and trash in the river: those generated in the U.S. and those generated in Mexico that are transported into the Tijuana River Valley through transboundary flows. In the ARP, we estimate the amount that each source contributes to the lower Tijuana River. There are a couple things on this slide I want to explain in case you're not already familiar. First, the units for the estimated bacteria loading, MPN. MPN stands for most probable number. Bacteria are often estimated in these units, and the value is the number of bacteria from a field sample based on growing the bacteria in a laboratory. The bacteria loads we see here are so large that the values are in the format of scientific notation. In scientific notation, the exponent on that number 10 indicates how many times you move the decimal point to the right. So for example, for E. coli from transboundary flows, that decimal point moves 17 times to the right. So it's 106 followed by 15 zeros. That's too large of a number to fit here, so we use scientific notation. These are very large numbers because they are estimates of the total number of E. coli and Enterococci bacteria that reach the lower river each year. In other words, what we call annual loads of indicator bacteria. When we estimate the bacteria and trash sources in the U.S. and compare that, the bacteria and the trash sources in the U.S., as we have listed here, when we compare those to the transboundary flows, we can see that the transboundary flows are clearly the primary source of these pollutants. And we estimate that they're responsible for over 97% of the bacteria loading to the lower river and at least 96% of the trash loading. A much smaller percentage of bacteria and trash that end up in the river are generated in the U.S. These sources include stormwater discharges, agricultural operations, and open space and public lands. More significantly, transboundary flows transport wastewater and trash from Mexico through the Tijuana River Flood Control Channel, which is the main channel, and these 6 cross-border tributaries to the west that are hydrologically connected to the river: Stewart's Drain, Silva Drain, Canyon del Sol, Smuggler's Gulch, Goat Canyon, and Yogurt Canyon. The ARP includes total maximum daily loads for the indicator bacteria and trash in the lower river. Let me explain what a total maximum daily load, or TMDL, is. A TMDL value is the maximum amount of a pollutant allowed to enter a water body so that the water body will meet and continue to meet water quality standards for that particular pollutant in order to support human and ecological uses. So for example, an estuary naturally receives some nutrients. These nutrients are part of how the estuary's intricate biological system thrives. A beneficial amount of nutrients falls within a given range for that estuary seasonally, and too much will disrupt or impair the estuary's function. The same can be said for the excess of other constituents as well. How much is too much? Determining what a TMDL value is just that. It is calculated or otherwise derived from established standards based on the conditions of the water body. The TMDL value is the maximum amount, or what we refer to as load, of nutrients, or whatever else we're evaluating, that can be discharged to that water body before it causes impairments. That allowable load has to be expressed over a period of time, at minimum a daily load. That's why it's called a total maximum daily load. The ARP includes total maximum daily loads for the 2 types of indicator bacteria and for trash. These are the maximum allowable levels of indicator bacteria and trash so that the river is not impaired and can support all of its beneficial uses, and also provide protection for the estuary and downstream coastline that are continuously affected. Sometimes when we hear the phrase adopting a TMDL, it has a colloquial meaning that relates to rulemaking to amend the San Diego Water Board Basin Plan. But for this presentation and the ARP in general, the term TMDL is not referring to that. It's just referring to that maximum allowable amount of the pollutant. So these are the TMDLs for bacteria in the lower Tijuana River. They're derived from E. coli and Enterococci levels that represent currently acceptable health risks in recreational waters. They include a 6-week rolling geometric mean calculated weekly, as well as a daily value for both E. coli and Enterococci. These cannot be exceeded. So for E. coli, the maximum geometric mean is 100 CFU, which is colony forming units, per 100 milliliters, and the daily maximum is 320 CFU per 100 milliliters. For Enterococci, the maximum geometric mean is 300 CFU per 100 milliliters, and the daily maximum is 110 CFU per 100 milliliters. For the sake of this ARP, the bacteria units I described earlier, most probable number, or MPN, that's interchangeable with colony forming units, CFU. So these numbers may seem really large, but remember, these are indicator bacteria. We commonly see these bacteria in the environment, but when we see a large number of them, it indicates there may be pathogenic bacteria and viruses that threaten human health. The pathogenic bacteria and viruses would be far fewer in number and may be difficult to detect, but E. coli and enterococci at these levels are a warning sign that they may be present. For trash, the TMDL was derived from narrative water quality objectives in the San Diego Water Board Basin Plan and from the State Water Board trash amendments. Trash cannot be present in amounts that adversely affect beneficial uses or cause nuisance. Load allocations and waste load allocations refer to how a TMDL is allocated among the various sources of the pollutant to attain water quality standards. Non-point sources of the pollutant receive load allocations, and point sources receive waste load allocations. In this ARP, the load and waste load allocations are set equivalent to the TMDL values themselves. So here are the same TMDL values again, but as the assigned load allocations and waste load allocations for bacteria. So the point sources and non-point sources of indicator bacteria must not exceed these levels in order to protect human health. And the same for trash as well. The load and waste load allocations are set equivalent to the trash TMDL. The point sources and non-point sources of trash must not adversely affect beneficial uses of the river or cause nuisance. The overall goal of the ARP is to reduce bacteria levels and trash to acceptable levels so that the river is no longer impaired by these pollutants. We know that they are present in excessive quantities and that actions are needed to reduce them substantially. In the ARP, those actions are presented in an implementation plan. The implementation plan identifies our existing regulatory orders that control these potential sources of pollutants generated in the U.S. The implementation plan calls for the State Water Board and San Diego Water Board to modify those regulatory orders if needed to add requirements that will reduce bacteria and trash discharged to the lower Tijuana River. This includes several types of stormwater discharges, as well as agricultural operations and discharges from groundwater extraction. As a reminder, we estimate that the U.S. sources account for less than 3% of the indicator bacteria and no more than 4% of the total trash. So in order for bacteria and trash TMDLs to be met in the river, transboundary sources must be reduced substantially. Those transboundary flows are the significant sources of pollution to the lower Tijuana River. Indicator bacteria must be reduced by over 98% in the transboundary flows to achieve load allocations. Trash must also be reduced substantially so that it does not compromise beneficial uses of the river. The San Diego Water Board has no regulatory authority in Mexico, so unlike the pollutants generated in the U.S., we have no means to regulate the sources in Mexico. However, federal agencies that handle border sanitation issues have evaluated projects to improve water quality conditions in the Tijuana River, estuary, and the coastline near the border. I'm referring to the U.S. section of the International Boundary and Water Commission, or USIBWC, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or US EPA. Last June, in a joint record of decision, USIBWC and US EPA decided to implement 10 projects to mitigate polluted transboundary flows. These are the USMCA projects I mentioned earlier. More specifically, the USMCA Comprehensive Infrastructure Solution. All of these projects aim to improve water quality in the local border region. The projects that are highlighted in the slide involve construction and operation of infrastructure in the U.S., which also means the San Diego Water Board will have a role in permitting them. Only one of these projects has been fully funded, the San Antonio de los Buenos plant in Mexico. The two with just $1 sign next to them have partial funding, and the rest have not received any funding yet. The wastewater reuse project in Mexico, that's the third one from the bottom, that one has been studied, and a trash boom pilot project has been funded by the state of California to inform the permanent trash boom design and maintenance, which is the last one on this list. So those both have momentum, but the projects themselves have not been funded yet. Once in place, these projects will substantially reduce the transboundary river flows and improve water quality. US IBWC and US EPA estimate a 76% reduction in main channel transboundary flow days and a 21% reduction in the annual volume. I just want to mention that one really critical piece of this is the advanced primary treatment plant. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. So right here, the fourth and fifth bullets, construction of advanced primary treatment plant, and then expanding that advanced primary treatment plant. That's a really critical piece because this will actually treat flows that come through the main channel. And at first that will be up to 35 million gallons a day, and eventually up to 60 million gallons per day. The ARP's implementation plan ties into the projects in the USMCA Comprehensive Infrastructure Solution by calling for the MOU between the San Diego Water Board, US IBWC, and US EPA. The Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, may also be part of the MOU since it owns land and infrastructure along the border. The MOU will establish agreements, roles, and responsibilities within each agency's respective jurisdiction and funding allocations to control transboundary sources of pollution. The MOU we envision will include actions to implement a program to reduce trash loads, describe how the San Diego Water Board and federal agencies will move forward on collaborative design and permitting of US-side projects, including the USMCA projects. It will describe how to resolve disputes should they arise, establish maintenance responsibility, and outline how monitoring will be carried out to see if bacteria and trash reduction goals are being met. Dischargers of trash to the lower Tijuana River should propose a minimum frequency of assessment and collection, or MFAC, program to the San Diego Water Board that consists of regularly scheduled trash assessment, collection, and disposal, along with trash control measures. This is also part of the ARP's implementation plan. These activities should be scheduled at intervals that prevent trash from accumulating to the extent that causes nuisance or adversely affects beneficial uses of the river between trash collections. A few items that should be included in the MFAC program are an estimate of the annual baseline loading of trash in the Tijuana River Valley from transboundary flows, trash monitoring stations at key sites in the Tijuana River Valley, trash monitoring frequency of at least once per transboundary flow event during dry and wet weather, and annual reporting of trash monitoring to the San Diego Water Board. The MFAC program should involve all dischargers of trash to the lower Tijuana River, including dischargers in the U.S. However, since the transboundary flows deposit the vast majority of the trash, US IBWC would be expected to have the primary role and responsibilities of the MFAC program. This is something that would be defined in the MOU. The ARP's implementation plan also includes this schedule for progressive trash reductions. Progress on these reductions should be included in the annual MFAC program report. By year 5 after adoption of the ARP, there should be a 50% reduction in trash in the lower Tijuana River and ongoing reductions thereafter. An essential component for restoration is water quality monitoring, which is discussed in the ARP. Water quality monitoring is needed to evaluate the progress toward restoration of the beneficial uses in receiving waters. In addition, water quality data are necessary to support the removal of a water body from the 303D list. All regulatory orders modified or developed to include requirements to achieve load or waste load allocations must also include monitoring requirements to assess the effectiveness of achieving those load and waste load allocations. In addition, the ARP includes proposed components of a monitoring program for significant sources of pollution specifically and for receiving waters. This includes monitoring stations, assessment goals, and a model to predict pathogen abundance in the lower Tijuana River and coastal waters. Annual reporting prepared by dischargers should assess reductions in discharges of indicator bacteria and trash, and assess if dischargers are achieving load and waste load allocations, water quality objectives in the river, and progressive trash reductions. I mentioned before that one advantage of an ARP versus other options in the state's impaired waters policy is that it is more adaptable. We have more flexibility as we implement the ARP. That can include making course corrections as we evaluate monitoring data. So that basically covers the main components of the draft Advanced Restoration Program. You know, circumstances of the Tijuana River Valley are unique and make it challenging to regulate and to control the significant sources of pollution. So an ARP like this that is more flexible and adaptive is a practical fit. Our agency has taken this approach with other impaired waters in the region and has experienced success with improving water quality. Border pollution challenges can feel daunting, but there are many examples of environmental crises that were eventually remedied with the advocacy and persistence needed to channel resources these crises needed. The Cuyahoga River in Ohio is a classic example. Those cases serve as reminders to keep pushing forward and remain hopeful about the future of the Tijuana River, estuary, and nearby coastlines. So I've provided an overview of the draft ARP, but if you would like more details, I welcome you to ask questions here at this workshop, and I also encourage you to review the document itself if you haven't already. It's online, and we are accepting public comments on it until March 13th. As a reminder, because we want everyone that wants to provide comments on the ARP today to have an opportunity, we're asking that comments be limited to 3 minutes, and we're asking that questions and comments be related to the workshop theme, the ARP specifically. If you do have questions and comments that are not related to the ARP itself, please share those at the end. And of course, you can also provide verbal comments on border pollution or any other water quality issues in the region at the regular San Diego Water Board public meetings. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Dave Gibson and Cynthia Gorham are also with us today to hear your comments and to help answer any questions you may have. So let's see, I'm going to look on the attendee list, and if I see any raised hands, I'll just give you the opportunity to talk in the order that you raise your hand. So please feel free to ask questions or let us know what kind of input you have on the draft restoration plan. Okay.
Yes, Mary Johnson Powell, you're cleared to talk.
But you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for doing this workshop. It's really, really informative. I appreciate all the work that you all do. It's complex and long range, and those of us in the Tijuana River Valley are so thankful. And I have a question, just kind of hypothetically, once this plan is implemented and things are going along, what happens if something like what just occurred, which is the Smuggler's Gulch berm was breached on the west side and private property flooded through another berm, and now the campground is under sewage? What happens if something from Mexico comes through later like that? How does all of this address that? Is there means for that?
Yes, Mary, I think you know better than anyone how difficult and challenging it can be to work with flooding issues from sedimentation from Mexico and just from excessive flows. So we will continue to work through the 2 sections of the International Boundary and Water Commission to try to address source control, which indeed we've been doing right now with the project in Smuggler's Gulch. There's an excessive amount of sediment coming out of that road construction project. It would seem that there are no construction stormwater BMPs at all. With regard to the river valley issues, we'll continue to, in fact, be ramping up the recovery team as a coordination group again, now that we've moved past some of the issues that we focused on the last few years. So I've already raised the issue of the berms with the city of San Diego, and I anticipate working with the county and city of San Diego to try to address those issues and to eventually eliminate the flooding there in the campground. The water board does possess some very substantial authorities, which we can use in places like cleanup and abatement orders. But in this case, I think a multiple agency coordination project and executing the projects that Senate Bill 170 have funded, like the Brown property restoration and the Smuggler's Gulch sediment basin, will be the way that we can restore those areas once again. But it will require multiple jurisdictions coordinating. And regrettably, because the nesting season is almost upon us, probably most of that work will have to wait until after the breeding season. But at our last workshop, we did have U.S. Fish and Wildlife there. Made it a point to talk with them. And so we'll be coordinating with them as well. So if there's any option for us to go forward in the interim with limited work, we can do that as well. But it's a very excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Ben. Hi.
Hello. Yes, thank you so much, Melissa, and Dave and Cynthia, just for all the work that's been put into this plan and for just the regional board's focus on this issue for the years that you really focused on it. A couple questions I have in terms of looking at beneficial uses, what would be kind of the baseline or the vision for the restoration that we're looking at? You know, what's the future vision for, you know, when restoration is complete? What do beneficial uses look like in the lower Tijuana River?
Well, so the TMDLs for bacteria are based on recreational standards. Like I said, you know, in the presentation, we have over 20 pollutants on the 303D list, but we picked trash and bacteria just because if we can control the polluted urban runoff and sewage, if we can reduce those flows, right, or that being introduced into the lower river, then it's going to help with other types of pollutants that could affect other types of beneficial uses. So we're sort of focusing, you know, with the bacteria, we're focusing on the recreational beneficial use. But in reality, the efforts to reduce trash and bacteria are so we can restore all of the beneficial uses. Am I answering your question?
Yes, I mean, I'm very aware of like the, you know, the history of the watershed, and that, you know, at one point there was steelhead, you know, in the river. Like, are we looking at a restoration plan to get back to that place?
I would love to do that. That would be excellent, Ben. In the shorter term, I want to look to, and we are looking towards what the measures and metrics the EPA have already identified, like the reduction of flows in the Tijuana River, reducing them by a minimum of 76%, as much as 90% if we're able to execute the fullest vision of the record of decision and have effective source control in Mexico. And the shorter answer to your question is I want to see an end to the continuous beach closures all along the coast from Borderfield State Park up to Coronado, and attainment of the water quality objectives for bacterial indicators in the river valley itself, and an end of the trash loads below Dairy Mart Road. Those are quantifiable metrics that we can attain, and that would be the goal of the advanced restoration plans. There are other constituents of concern. I've identified at least 10 total maximum daily loads or alternatives that we would have to develop. These are the first two and the most important two, but the others have not been overlooked. They're going to be in the pipeline behind this one. And the agreement approach that I've discussed with EPA and IBWC would plug those in as we develop them if we get the kind of resource support we need to write those up and advance them. Fortunately, the measures that EPA has been discussing and identified in their programmatic environmental impact statement and their record of decision are the physical measures we would need to attain those for the other chemical constituents of concern. But source control in Mexico remains a paramount importance, particularly for industrial wastes. So there will be monitoring in that agreement as well to try to identify those sources and abate them through Mexican laws and government agencies. But for your short-term answer, I want to get the bacterial indicators back down to what they were before 2010 and get the trash out of the river.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And I have two follow-up questions, but maybe let other folks have a chance to ask first.
Nobody. Oh, actually, Margarita just raised her hand. One moment.
Thank you, Ben.
Okay,
and we will definitely come back to you as I think we'll have time. But Margarita, you're up next.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. No, thank you. And thank you very much to the opportunity and the explanation, the document and this workshop. Thank you. And I have a question, and I want to see if I understood. The way that it's going to be communicating, like the Mexican side officials and like NGOs as us, it will be through SILA to IWC. It will be through those means, the communication between the government of Mexico and us, or it will be like we can share information like directly with the water board. Like how will be the, like if we have some information, how we can share information with you guys, or if the officials are gonna share like from the Mexican side. I know this is all in the US, but we have to be communicating with the Mexican. It will be through IBWC. That will be the bridge or recovery.
I think that you can always share information with us directly, Margarita. I don't know if you're talking about, data or just observations you're making south of the border, but I don't see any reason you couldn't share any kind of information or data with us directly. But what's the agreement between the agreement between the government agencies and the MOU, that's just the U.S. side, federal agencies and us, so EPA, IBWC, possibly Department of Homeland Security, and us, and we're focusing on those U.S. side projects, and in part the role that our agency will take in permitting those projects. But of course, as you know, there's a lot going on south of the border as well. That won't really be part of the MOU. Those agreements will all tie into the U.S. side projects, or the projects that there might be some sort of construction in Mexico and the U.S. But anything that is, I guess, related, kind of at the federal level with the communications on those projects or monitoring and such, it goes from, IBWC U.S. section to the Mexican section. So for example, we don't generally interface with CEST directly. If we need information, we usually ask IBWC, and then U.S. IBWC, they put in a request with the Mexican section, and then the Mexican section will ask for information or correspond however is needed with CEST. That's how it's usually done. But if you're talking about if you have information or data to provide that would be useful in advancing this restoration, that's always information you can share with us directly.
No, thank you. Yes, our information, I know, and I think that the opening of you guys are receiving our information. But my question was more like with our officials, like us, to tell them use this communication with CEST, go with IWC to talk to you guys. For us to push our officials, I want to know where I have to push them to, through that door, so we can have this communication. And as an NGO, we communicate directly. And thank you very much. We have some information, really, really important information we want to share with you guys.
Yeah, thank you, Margarita. We'll be continuing the recovery team, and indeed, I plan to ramp it back up again, similar to what we had a few years ago before we went to litigation and TMDLs and permitting and other enforcement tools. So there'll be a place for us to share information. We'll invite agencies from Mexico to do so, but we need to communicate through IBWC and through US EPA. IBWC has the diplomatic mission to coordinate with another country, and EPA has the technical mission to coordinate technically with Mexico. The state of California can't insert itself in the middle of that. That's one of the purposes for the MOU that I've described, would be to work through them through the appropriate channels with appropriate allocations and authorizations and jurisdiction. We're not going to be able to presume upon that relationship that they have with their counterparts in Mexico.
Yeah, it's what I understand. Thank you very much. And thank you for your work.
And I believe our next speaker up is Max Dugan. And Margarita, I think you can lower your hand. There we go. Yeah. Go ahead, Max.
Hi, yeah, thanks for presenting this. And you just touched on my question a little bit, but given the board's limitations jurisdictionally, will the MOU or plan have enforcement mechanisms or other elements to secure additional funding for either upfront capital costs that have not been covered so far, or ongoing operations and maintenance, since we know that those are so important to effective operation of these treatment plants and other solutions?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that, Max. One is that the Water Board doesn't set aside its enforcement tools where we have them. And we have had similar agreements with the U.S. Marine Corps, the U.S. Navy. So we're able to make these work and get the results we need. But one of the items in the agreement would be within our jurisdiction, within our funding authorities and authorizations, to communicate the need for those capital fundings, to work together to try to make sure that our elected officials are informed. We're not allowed to lobby, but we can say a lot about what we need and what it would cost and what the benefits would be from those measures. And I believe IBWC, certainly I have been spending a great deal of time on that effort. So coordinating that is probably one of the best ways for us to realize the ambition of the record of decision. But the Water Board, in entering an agreement like this, we preserve our authorities and we work collaboratively where we can with the federal agencies who enjoy a measure of sovereign immunity to get the outcomes we want. And in this case, reduced river flows and end of the daily beach closures through the infrastructure projects in minute 328 and in the record of decision is how we're going to get there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ben, I don't see any other hands up. Did you want to ask your follow-up questions?
I'd love to. Thank you so much. Yeah, so my next plan was I was reflecting a bit in terms of, when I first started working on this issue back in 2005, the population of the watershed was much less. Like since then, it's grown over 50%, almost by 1 million people. And my question there is, how does this plan reflect and take into account, maybe population growth estimates for the watershed?
I think the shortest answer I can give to that, Ben, is that US EPA in their programmatic environmental impact statement really did envision the continued growth of Tijuana and the need for a partnership approach by the two countries to implement the infrastructure solutions for source control in Mexico, which we need, but also acknowledging that these flows cross the border and we're going to have to continue to address them. So it did in fact envision growth in Tijuana. And the more ambitious elements of the record of decision are the ones that sadly have been delayed in funding that would help accommodate that. For example, the international treatment plant would be expanded to 50 million gallons per day. But really, I think we can all acknowledge that 60 million gallons would be far better and would in fact anticipate the continued growth of Tijuana. In addition, the water recycling and return option that Melissa described in her presentation, that's really trying to address climate change and the prospect for long periods of drought punctuated by wild and crazy atmospheric rivers, where reusable supplies of water are going to be critical to our communities in Tijuana, no less so than in the city of San Diego, where they're pursuing their pure water project. I think we're going to see a real return to recycled water as a core component of our infrastructure needs going forward. And so I think that's going to be true for Tijuana as it is for us. So I'm hopeful that elected officials will understand the net benefits to the United States and Mexico, San Diego and Tijuana, and get the funding that we need for the totality of the projects in the record of decision, not just the most easily attainable ones or the most obvious ones like expanding the treatment plant.
Thanks, Dave. That's super helpful. And A next question there is kind of, I think from my reading of the ARP, I think I really see kind of a focus on stopping or decreasing the point and non-point source pollutants in terms of like discharges. I think that's spot on. I also know just how many layers of existing pollutants and trash exist in the river valley. And so kind of wondering, you know, is restoration of the existing pollutants and layer upon layer of trash in the river valley, is that a part of this ARP?
It's not something that we address specifically in the ARP, but it is something that could be part of that minimum frequency and collection program, potentially. We're really kind of just looking at the ongoing discharges coming across the border, not really like the legacy pollution. But it's not to say that it couldn't be addressed, because if we're seeing that, you know, beneficial uses are being compromised by that trash. I don't want to say just trash, because we know that it's commingled with sediment and vegetation and things like that. But if we're seeing that that is disruptive to the beneficial uses, compromising the beneficial uses of the river, that is something that also could be addressed.
Yes, Ben, the long-term restoration.
That's how I see it in the MFAC.
Yeah. The long-term restoration, Ben, will only be successful if we can stop the bleeding first, especially for trash. And trash is actually the easiest of all the things we could control cross-border flows and maybe do a better job of source control in Mexico. So until we get the trash stopped at Dairy Mart Road and Monument Mesa Road, we're going to just be continuing to chase the target. That said, there's some absolutely excellent opportunities for restoration there. The Tetrip Marsh restoration is certainly a big one, but there are opportunities to go into the south channel of the Tijuana River and remove some of that historically deposited trash and realize mitigation credits potentially out of that. So I've discussed this with the city of San Diego. I've identified this as an area that they should probably be looking at to get mitigation for the channel maintenance work they need to do elsewhere in the city. I'm willing to go there for out of watershed credits if the city wants to work with the county of San Diego, parks, or others to realize mitigation potential through restoration, both the removal of wastes like we're doing on the Brown property, but also the reestablishment of riparian habitats and estuary habitats. So there are some opportunities there and some interests in doing that, but it's going to have to be a longer run set of projects through the recovery team and the interagency coordination. And again, we'll be constrained by breeding seasons and the concurrence of the wildlife agencies that we can execute those projects without impacting least bells vireos, among other species. But I'm optimistic that once we get the trash control in place in Mexico and in the channels, that we can begin to address the historic deposits of that material in the valley downstream.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Melissa.
Other comments or questions?
Oh, I just saw a hand go up.
Go ahead, Ben.
To give me the opportunity, I'll ask
Yeah.
one.
Please.
Go for it.
I'm really interested, kind of like what do you see as the main obstacles to implementing, you know, getting this plan over the finish line and getting it implemented?
I know my answer. Melissa, what do you want to say?
Funding?
Funding. It's all funding, Ben. It's federal funding. Both countries need to come together on the funding solution. And the frustrating thing, I think, for all of us is that we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it isn't necessarily a train, but it requires commitments of funding. And right now, even the expansion of the international treatment plant, it's only 50% funded. Another $310 million has been requested, but even that isn't all we need for that treatment plant to be state of the art. Wouldn't include sludge digestion, for example, and it doesn't gather in the flows from Montedero Canyon community and Las Orelas community, which we'd hoped for in the original study and plans. Instead, those canyons will be continuing to deliver wastewater to San Antonio de los Buenos, which means that San Antonio will be at capacity almost on the day it starts, because those two canyons send about 12 million gallons, and it's an 18 million gallon facility they build there. We can make that facility far more successful if we were able to send those flows to the international treatment plant as was originally conceived. This is strictly a funding issue. This is not because they can't build it or don't know what to build. We've studied this for more than 20 years. We know what we need to do. EPA has studied it very, very well. All that's lacking is federal funding from the two countries. Even the state of California, where they wish to come in and help, cannot give money to IBWC until Congress authorizes the receipt of that money. So while we can do a pilot trash project, for example, IBWC can't keep that trash boom, even if they like it, until Congress says that they can. So it's a funding issue on several levels and from several perspectives, but that's the real bottom line.
Thanks, Dave.
Other questions? Well, I'll share a question that we had at the in-person workshop on Monday. With regards to the MOU, working with federal agencies to try to realize the projects that they've already studied and conceived and have partial funding for, when will that MOU be done? Our plan is to bring the advanced restoration plans to the board for their consideration this year, with the to-do item being to negotiate that MOU with the attorneys and the staff and the directors of IBWC and EPA, possibly Customs and Border Protection. We had a similar agreement with them before, back in the 1990s, after Minute 283 was approved, to guide the development and construction of the international treatment plant, which was very successful in its time. We've simply outgrown it. So we're starting with that old agreement. We're resurrecting it, and we're adding some of the additional components. My plan, perhaps naively optimistically, is to have a draft to those agencies for discussion by December of this year. And to be able to have a public resolution on that for the board to enter into that agreement with those agencies when we've ironed out the fine details, because the details do matter a great deal. But the board wants to be as objective and as transparent as possible in that process, because the implementation plan is really contingent upon realizing that record of decision in its totality. And so that would be our goal with that agreement. We have talked about binational monitoring as one of the components, one of several components in that. In addition is the flood control channel. Eventually, IBWC will have to do some maintenance on that channel to restore it to its flood control capacity. That is also an opportunity for us to work together, and where the Water Board has specific regulatory authorities that can be useful to ensure that what IBWC is able to afford and can do with congressional authorization and direction helps us achieve the long-term vision for control of flooding as well as for trash in the river valley. So there are several elements that we want to go forward with, many of which won't bear fruit for some years. But having a working relationship with the federal agencies is the best way forward for us to realize the restoration of those beneficial uses and their maintenance thereafter. So look for that. The board will consider the advanced restoration plans first, and then we'll consider a memorandum of understanding if we're able to come to terms with those agencies. We'll have to confer with Customs and Border Protection at a minimum, because it's very clear and we don't wish to confound their mission. And I really appreciate Customs and Border Protection's support and assistance in locating the likely site for the trash boom that we're going to try out there, hopefully this coming winter. Being able to work with them so we don't interfere with their mission is critical, and they can really facilitate progress as they did with that project. If I can just get the people up in Sacramento to approve contracts faster, we can actually see that built and operated sooner. And I really regret we didn't have it in place this winter. I would like to have seen a worst case scenario test of the design, but be that as it may, we'll get that installed with their cooperation. And one of the elements of the agreement will be, how do we learn from that and how do we address it then in a permanent Project J? Any other questions?
Sorry,
Ben?
one more
No,
question.
don't
Please,
apologize.
Ben.
Yeah,
That's what we're here
I
for.
know Dave, you mentioned just the importance of having ongoing dialogue and collaboration with the federal agencies like the IBWC. And I know like the history with some of the lawsuits that have, been levied on the IBWC, et cetera, that's it seems like it's created some obstacles in the past to that kind of ongoing communication with the agency. At least that's what maybe they've shared. I'm just wondering, as we look at, you know, another round of potential lawsuits, do you see any obstacles to that ongoing communication and collaboration with the federal officials that, or agencies that the regional board needs to have to make this plan go forward?
Thank you, Ben. That's a really good and interesting question. I'll point out that in 2001, when the Water Board litigated, and again in 2018, nobody had any money to make the changes to the international treatment plant the Water Board wanted to see for it to meet secondary, or to address the transboundary flows that even in 2018 were beginning to become truly problematic for us and become outside the range of just being able to cooperate and manage in place. We have a different set of circumstances right now. Not only is there money, not enough, there's also a discussion of money, which there never was before, not in any serious way. And we also have a plan. We know what we have to build and how it can be operated, both in Mexico and the US, to reduce the flows and reduce the pollutants. In our view right now, focusing on those outcomes through a collaborative partnership with a cooperative International Boundary and Water Commission is the best way to get the results that we want. I've worked with two commissioners. I have to say very candidly, Commissioner Hanar is not Commissioner Dresina and not Commissioner Harkin. And she's been willing to ask tough questions and make progress in negotiations and discussions with her counterpart in Mexico that we didn't see before. So naively optimistic perhaps, but at least for right now, we have an ability to work together to implement that record of decision through this MOU and to get those loads reduced and to get the infrastructure in place that we're going to need Tijuana and San Diego for the foreseeable future. But that's a short term right now. Commissioner Hanar won't be around forever. And so what we want is an institutionalized approach between California and the federal agencies that takes the long view and ensures that we don't lose traction on the other projects while we focus on the really, really big and important one of expanding the international treatment plant and seeing San Antonio de los Buenos completed and the other infrastructure projects in Mexico completed.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.
Any other questions? I know that we have the County of San Diego represented here, so I'll repeat what I said at the meeting on Monday. Another question. State and local agencies have been implementing projects to deal with the transboundary flows of sediment and trash, as well as polluted water for decades now. I think State Parks has probably spent more than $20 million just on the Goat Canyon sediment basins and trash boom. So one of the goals I have with the agreement going forward is to try to work and identify, pursuant to congressional funding and authorization, a federal fair share for the costs of operations and maintenance. Border Patrol in particular has made this an issue that they want us to address with any infrastructure that California funds or local agencies implement. Has to be an operations and maintenance plan. So the County of San Diego, in building a sediment basin and trash boom in Smuggler's Gulch, mirroring the ones in Goat Canyon, I want to see the federal government help share some of the costs of that as part of the implementation plan of the advanced restoration plans. It is, I think, a question of fairness, but again, this is a federal funding decision. All we can do is identify the need and the net value to the governments for considering that as a funding option. But in the meantime, it's something we absolutely want to pursue in terms of discussions with them as these projects are implemented and improved as the funding from state funds winds down. The Senate Bill 170 funds, we talked them into covering operations and maintenance for the duration of the pilot projects. But after that, the projects wouldn't be funded except through local funds. Now we need to have a longer term, better solution than that.
I don't see any other hands up. Does anybody else have questions or any input you want to provide as we work through this draft of the ARP?
Not everyone is comfortable speaking in front of a crowd, even online. So Melissa and I, for example, are available to you. I think you have our contact information, and Melissa described how you can provide comments for the board's consideration on the advanced restoration plans when it gets to their adoption. But we're available today and tomorrow and hereafter if you have further questions. We have discussed these approaches generally at the recovery team steering committee meetings. I do plan to have another steering committee meeting later this month in March, and we'll discuss, if not at that meeting, then at the June meeting, resumption of some of the public meetings so that we can continue this discussion and have a checkpoint for the concerned citizens in Imperial Beach and San Ysidro and in Tijuana, for that matter, on how we address these issues in both countries. So trying to resume that engagement that we used to have is one of our priorities. But we're available to you today, and if you have questions offline, they're available for you later.
Yes, the public notice for this workshop had contact information in it, so feel free to shoot us an email, give us a call. Just let us know if you have any other questions or any kind of input on the ARP. We're here for you. Okay, I don't see any other hands up, so I guess we're good for now. And so thanks again for everybody joining us. Really appreciate all the good questions. It's a challenging situation. I think everybody here knows that. But we're all doing what we can. And we really appreciate your engagement and your questions, and don't hesitate to contact us.
Yes. And you can send in written comments as well by March 13th.
Right. Okay, very good. Okay, well, thank you,
much.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone.